I've always been a big fan of camping out of my truck. It's simple, convenient, and offers a bit more protection than just a tent on the ground. I outfitted the bed with a decent mattress, a few blankets, and a topper to keep me dry and safe from the elements. Most nights, it's been a perfect setup. There's something comforting about being able to lock the truck up and feel secure, even when you're in the middle of nowhere. Last fall, I headed out to one of my favorite remote spots. It was miles off the beaten path, at the end of an old logging road that rarely saw any traffic. The leaves were turning, and the crisp, cool air made for perfect camping weather. I spent the evening by the fire, cooking up a small dinner and watching the stars slowly emerge. There wasn't another soul for miles, just the way I liked it. When the night started to get cold, I climbed into the back of the truck, secured the hatch, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The small space inside the topper felt cozy, and the sounds of the forest outside lulled me to sleep quickly. But somewhere in the middle of the night, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what had startled me. I lay there in the dark, listening. The air was still, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I started to relax, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint, deliberate scratching against the glass of the back hatch. My body went rigid, every muscle tense. I held my breath, listening again. There it was, slow, deliberate scratches, like someone, or something, was running their fingernails across the glass. It wasn't an animal brushing against the truck, or branches in the wind. It was intentional. I carefully reached for my flashlight, heart pounding in my chest. I flicked it on, aiming it toward the back window, but the light reflected off the glass, making it hard to see anything outside. The scratching stopped for a moment, as if whatever was out there knew I was awake. I stayed still, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to throw open the hatch and confront whoever or whatever was out there. But the rational part of me told me to stay put. I was locked in, and there was no sense in putting myself in danger. Just as I was debating my next move, the scratching started again. This time, faster, more frantic. It wasn't just a single line across the glass now. It was as if something was clawing at it, trying to get in. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? No, it didn't sound like that. An animal wouldn't scratch like that. And a person? Why would someone be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, messing with my truck? I yelled, trying to sound as threatening as possible. Get out of here! I'm armed! But the scratching didn't stop. If anything, it grew more intense, like whatever was out there didn't care. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as I stared at the back window, waiting for something, anything, to appear in the faint reflection of the glass. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, flashlight still aimed at the window, but nothing happened. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Slowly, I inched toward the small side window, angling the flashlight to see if I could catch a glimpse of whatever had been there. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the ground around my truck. Nothing. No movement. No signs of anyone or anything. But I knew something had been there. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the light. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed there, flashlight in one hand, the other resting on the handle of the knife I kept near my bed. Every rustle, every creak of the truck made my heart jump, but the scratching didn't return. At first light, I didn't waste any time. I packed up quickly, my eyes darting to the tree line the entire time, half expecting something to step out of the shadows. When I went to inspect the back window, my stomach tightened. There, etched into the dust on the glass, were faint scratch marks, too precise to be made by branches or some animal. Long, thin lines, almost like fingers, had scraped across the surface. I got out of there as fast as I could, not daring to look back as I drove down the narrow logging road. Even now, I don't know what was out there that night, scratching at the glass of my truck. But whatever it was deliberate. And it still haunts me to think about how close it had been. Last summer, I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep in the wilderness, far from the trails most people frequent. I had always enjoyed the solitude of nature, and this area, a remote section of the national forest, had been on my list for a while. The first few days went by uneventfully. I hiked during the day, set up camp near a small stream in the evenings, and enjoyed the quiet. I had seen some wildlife, mainly deer, a couple of foxes, and a distant glimpse of a bear, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was on the fourth night that something strange happened. I had just finished dinner, and the fire was burning down to embers. The forest around me was alive with its usual night sounds: crickets chirping, the distant hoot of an owl. The air was cool, but not too cold, and everything seemed peaceful. I crawled into my tent and drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a noise. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. It wasn't the typical sounds of animals or the rustling of leaves. It was more like a low, guttural growl, almost like something large was exhaling heavily, just on the edge of camp. My heart started to race. I sat up, trying to listen, straining to make sense of the darkness. The fire had all but gone out, just a few glowing coals left, and the night was pitch black. The sound came again, closer this time. A deep, throaty grunt, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the brush. I grabbed my flashlight and my rifle, flicking on the beam and sweeping it through the trees. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear whatever it was. It was moving just beyond the reach of the light, too far to make out, but too close for comfort. I called out, hoping to scare it off, but there was no response, no change in the steady, unnerving noise. My mind raced, running through the possibilities. A bear? Maybe. But this didn't sound like any bear I had encountered. The growl was lower, almost like a deep rumble, and there was something unsettling about it. I wasn't dealing with an animal acting out of hunger or curiosity. This felt different. I knew I had to act. I fired a couple of warning shots into the ground, the sound of the gunshot echoing through the trees. For a moment, everything went silent. The night creatures stopped their chorus, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then I heard it. Whatever was out there turned and retreated, crashing through the underbrush. I stayed frozen, rifle in hand, listening to the fading sounds of its movement, until all I could hear was the distant creak and the return of the forest noises. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire, throwing on more wood to keep it blazing until the first light of dawn. As soon as it was bright enough to see, I packed up my gear and hiked out as fast as I could. The whole way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just out of sight. I never saw what it was that night, and to this day, I can't explain it. I've encountered plenty of wildlife on my trips, but this was different. There was an intelligence in the way it moved, a purpose. I haven't gone back to that area since. Maybe it was just an animal, something I've never encountered before. But in the back of my mind, I can't help but wonder if it was something else entirely. A few weeks ago, I decided to take a camping trip to a quiet, off-the-grid spot in the mountains. I've always enjoyed the peace of being out in nature, miles away from the nearest road or person. The first few days were perfect. Hiking through dense forest, sitting by the fire at night, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. I set up camp by a small, secluded lake, and by the third night, I was in full relaxation mode. That night, I settled into my tent early, the fire still crackling low outside, and fell asleep easily. At some point in the dead of night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. At first, I figured it was just a raccoon, or maybe a deer wandering nearby, so I ignored it. But after a few moments, the noise didn't stop. It got louder, more deliberate. I could hear something shuffling around the campsite, like footsteps crunching over the pine needles. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, my heart starting to pound. I flicked on the light and pointed it toward the noise, calling out, "Who's there?" expecting silence or the scurry of some startled animal. Instead, I got a reply. "Hey man, sorry to bother you," came this voice, calm, almost casual, but not something you'd ever expect to hear in the middle of nowhere at night. I froze for a second, trying to process it. The voice came from just outside the edge of my light's beam, where I could barely make out a figure standing between the trees. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. I stepped out of my tent, shining the light fully toward the guy. He looked like he'd been out there for a while. Grimy clothes, scruffy beard, and just off. There was something in his posture, the way he was standing there, that put me on edge immediately. "You lost or something?" I asked, gripping my rifle a little tighter, though I kept it pointed at the ground. "Nah, just wandering around. Thought I'd stop by your camp," he said, way too casual for someone who had just wandered into a stranger's campsite in the middle of the night. "Nice setup you got here. Mind if I hang out for a bit?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This guy was acting like we were at some public campground or something, not out in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. My gut was screaming that something wasn't right. "I think you should move on," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not looking for company." The guy just stood there, staring at me with this weird half-smile on his face, like he wasn't really hearing me. The silence stretched on, and I could feel the tension thickening in the air. After what felt like forever, he finally spoke again. "You sure? It gets real lonely out here, you know." His tone was almost playful, like we were sharing some inside joke. But there was this unsettling edge to it that made my skin crawl. "Yeah, I'm sure," I said firmly, taking a step forward, hoping the sight of the rifle would get my point across. "You need to go." For a second, I thought he might argue, but then he just shrugged. All right. No need to get all worked up. turned and started to walk away, but not before throwing one last comment over his shoulder. "Maybe I'll see you around." I stood there, heart pounding, watching him disappear into the trees, the beam of my flashlight following him until he was out of sight. Even after he was gone, I didn't feel any safer. I couldn't shake the feeling that this guy had been watching me for a while before I woke up. I sat by the fire the rest of the night, rifle in my lap, listening for any sound of him coming back. As soon as he disappeared into the trees, I didn't feel much better. I stoked the fire, sitting there in the quiet, my rifle resting on my knees. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, twigs snapping, the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the weirdness of the encounter, trying to make sense of it. But no matter how I turned it over, something about the guy just felt off. I must have dozed off at some point, because I jolted awake later. The fire had died down to embers, and the sky was still dark, just starting to hint at dawn. For a second, I thought everything was fine, that I'd been paranoid, and the guy was long gone. But then I heard it. Laughter. It was faint at first, almost like it was part of a dream. Then it grew louder, more distinct. Low, raspy chuckles, echoing through the trees. At first, I wasn't sure where it was coming from, but then I recognized the voice. It was him, the same guy from earlier, laughing out there in the woods, like it was the funniest thing in the world. I sat up, adrenaline surging through me, and grabbed my flashlight again. The laughter didn't stop. It was like he was right on the edge of camp, just out of sight, enjoying some private joke. My skin prickled, and my heart pounded as I scanned the trees, trying to spot him. "Hey!" I yelled, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "What the hell do you want?" The laughter paused for a moment, and then I heard his voice, calm and eerie in the stillness of the forest. "Just saying good morning, man. You look like you could use some company." I swept the flashlight across the trees, but I couldn't see him. He was staying just outside the circle of light again, lurking. The worst part was, I couldn't tell if he was messing with me or if he was seriously unstable. "You need to leave," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm not going to warn you again." But he didn't leave. Instead, I heard him moving through the underbrush, slowly circling the campsite, his laughter bubbling up again, each chuckle more sinister than the last. He wasn't just passing by now. He was toying with me, and it was clear he wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. I raised the rifle, pointing it in the direction of the noise, but I still couldn't see him. I had no idea where he was or what he might do next. The unease I'd felt earlier had shifted into full-blown terror. For a few minutes, the only sounds were his footsteps crunching over fallen leaves, and that maddening, creepy laughter, growing softer and then louder again as he moved. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. I stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything, any sign that he was still out there. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no voice, just the quiet of the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, rifle in hand, staring into the trees, half expecting him to come charging out of the dark at any moment. But he never did. As the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up as quickly as I could. Every minute felt like an hour, and the entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that he watching, waiting. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, miles away from that campsite. Even then, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me, like I'd crossed paths with something, or someone, I wasn't supposed to. To this day, I can still hear that laughter echoing in my mind, and it's kept me from going back to those deep, remote woods alone.